In the ancient world, childhood did not begin with celebration. It began with uncertainty. The moment a child was born, survival was not assumed. It was questioned. In many ancient societies, birth itself was one of the most dangerous moments of human life. There were no hospitals, no sterile rooms, no trained doctors as we understand them today. Most births happened inside small homes on dirt floors, assisted by family members or local midwives whose knowledge came from experience, not science. Infections were common. Complications were frequent. A difficult birth could end the life of the mother, the child, or both. Even when a baby survived the delivery, the danger was far from over. The first days and weeks were a silent trial. Fever, dehydration, and infection could claim a newborn without warning. This is why many ancient cultures delayed naming a child, not out of cruelty, but out of realism. To name a child too early was to invite grief. Families waited until survival seemed more likely. In some places, infants were not fully acknowledged as members of the household until weeks or even months had passed. Survival came first. Emotion followed later. The environment itself was hostile. Homes were cold in winter and suffocating in summer. Smoke from cooking fires filled the air. Clean water was never guaranteed. Animals lived close to humans, sometimes inside the same structure. Disease did not announce itself. It moved quietly, spreading through touch, breath, and contaminated food. Infant mortality was not an exception. It was expected. In some regions, as many as half of all children died before reaching the age of 5. Parents knew this. It shaped how they loved, how they hoped, and how they prepared for loss. Attachment existed, but it was guarded. Love grew slowly, built alongside survival. Children who survived the earliest years carried visible marks of hardship. Malnutrition was common. Many grew smaller than modern children. Illness left permanent damage. Teeth decayed early. Bones healed imperfectly. Survival often meant living with weakness. Yet childhood was not viewed with pity. It was viewed as preparation. From the moment a child could walk, they were observed. Strength mattered. Alertness mattered. Obedience mattered. A child who could not adapt became a burden, and in a world balanced on scarcity, burden could mean danger for everyone. There were no toys designed for learning, no protected spaces just for children. Play existed, but it was woven into work. A child learned by watching, by copying, by being corrected, often harshly. Discipline was not psychological, it was practical. A mistake could mean injury or death. A child who failed to listen could wander into danger, fall into fire, be trampled by animals, or contaminate food supplies. Strictness was survival logic, not moral cruelty. This early exposure to risk shaped a different kind of mind. Children learned fear early. They learned responsibility early. And they learned that survival was never guaranteed. By modern standards, this world feels brutal, but to them, it was normal. This was the opening chapter of life in the ancient world, a beginning defined not by innocence, but by endurance. And the dangers did not end after infancy. In the next section, we'll explore why so many children never reached adulthood, and what daily life looked like for those who did. If a child survived infancy, the danger did not disappear. It simply changed form. Between the ages of 2 and 10, the ancient world remained relentlessly hostile. Children were exposed to the same threats as adults, but without the strength, knowledge, or experience to protect themselves. Disease moved freely through villages. A single illness could wipe out multiple children in the same household within days. There were no vaccines, No antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. Fever was not a symptom. It was often a death sentence. Diarrhea caused by contaminated water led to fatal dehydration. Minor wounds became infected. A cut that would heal easily today could slowly poison a child's body. Nutrition offered little protection. Diets were monotonous and limited. Bread formed the base of most meals, supplemented by lentils, olives, and occasional vegetables. Meat was rare and usually reserved for festivals. Children growing bodies required protein and calories, but scarcity meant many never received enough. Periods of famine were devastating. When crops failed, children were the first to weaken. Their bodies had fewer reserves. Hunger slowed growth, weakened immunity, and made survival uncertain even after food returned. Accidents were another constant threat. Children lived close to danger. Open fires burned inside homes. Cooking pots sat low to the ground. Tools were not locked away. Animals moved freely through villages. Wells were uncovered. Roofs were flat and accessible. A single misstep could mean severe injury or death. There was no emergency response, no ambulance, no trauma care. An injured child depended entirely on family knowledge, herbal remedies, and luck. Parents knew this reality intimately. They watched children constantly, not out of affection, but out of necessity. And even with vigilance, loss was common. Grief became familiar. Death was woven into daily life. This constant exposure shaped attitudes toward childhood. There was little room for sentimentality. Survival mattered more than comfort. Children were expected to adapt quickly or risk becoming liabilities in an unforgiving environment. Reaching the age of 10 was not taken for granted. It was an achievement. Those who did survive were no longer seen as fragile. They were seen as potential contributors, which leads to the next harsh reality. Childhood did not last long. In the next section, we'll see how children became workers and why labor was not optional, but essential for survival. In the ancient world, childhood ended early, very early. By the age of 5 or 6, most children were already working. Not formally, not with wages, but as part of the household economy. Survival depended on every capable body contributing, regardless of age. There was no concept of helping out. Work was expected. Boys and girls were assigned tasks as soon as they could follow instructions. Younger children fetched water, gathered firewood, carried tools, or watched animals. Slightly older children worked in fields, tended livestock, assisted craftsmen, or helped prepare food. Learning happened through repetition. Mistakes were corrected immediately, often harshly. A child who failed to perform risked more than punishment. Failure could mean wasted resources, lost food, or injury to others. The margin for error was thin. Education, as we imagine it today, barely existed. Reading and writing were rare skills, reserved for scribes, priests, or elites. Most children learned what their parents knew. A farmer raised farmers. A potter raised potters. A shepherd raised shepherds. Skill meant survival. Children learned by watching hands, not listening to lectures. They memorized movements. They absorbed routines. Knowledge was practical, not theoretical. There was pride in competence. A child who could work was respected. A child who could not was vulnerable. Play existed, but it was brief and secondary. Games mimicked adult tasks, throwing stones, running, wrestling, anything that built strength, coordination, and endurance. Fatigue was constant. Children worked long hours under the same sun as adults. Injuries were common. Childhood bodies adapted or broke. This labor shaped identity early. Children did not grow up imagining who they wanted to be. They became who survival required them to be. Responsibility arrived before adolescence, and with responsibility came discipline, not the kind meant to nurture feelings, but the kind meant to produce obedience. In the next section, we'll explore how discipline, fear, and authority shaped ancient childhood, and why obedience was valued above all else. Discipline in the ancient world was not psychological, it was physical. Children were raised under constant authority. Parents, elders, and masters held unquestioned power. Obedience was not negotiable, it was essential. Ancient societies believed that a disobedient child threatened more than household order. They believed it threatened survival itself. A child who refused instruction could endanger food supplies, animals, tools, or younger siblings. This belief justified severe discipline. Corporal punishment was common and accepted. Beatings were not viewed as abuse, but as correction. Pain was seen as a teacher. Fear was a tool. This mindset appears repeatedly in ancient texts and laws. Obedience was praised. Rebellion was condemned. A child who defied authority was believed to bring shame and risk to the entire family. Children learned early where power resided. They learned when to speak, when to stay silent, when to submit. Emotional expression was limited. Vulnerability was discouraged. Strength was praised, even in children. This did not mean parents lacked affection. Love existed, but it was expressed differently. Protection, food, and survival were considered acts of love. Comfort and reassurance were secondary. Authority structures extended beyond the household. Elders, religious leaders, and community figures reinforced the same expectations. A child belonged not only to parents, but to the village. Fear of disgrace was powerful. A child's behavior reflected directly on the family's honor. One mistake could damage reputation, marriage prospects, and alliances. This pressure shaped compliance, and it shaped silence. Children learned quickly that survival required fitting into rigid roles. But these roles were not identical for boys and girls. Their paths diverged sharply. In the next section, we'll examine how ancient childhood differed by gender, and why girls faced dangers boys never did. For girls in the ancient world, childhood was even shorter, often brutally so. From an early age, girls were prepared for marriage. Their value was closely tied to family alliances, fertility, and honor. By adolescence, sometimes earlier, many were already promised to future husbands. Marriage was not about love, it was about survival. Girls were trained in domestic skills, food preparation, water management, textile work, and child care. These were not optional abilities. A woman's competence directly affected household stability. Physical maturity mattered more than emotional readiness. Puberty marked eligibility. A girl could become a wife and mother while still a child by modern standards. Pregnancy was dangerous. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for young women. Girls carried these risks without choice or preparation. Survival was uncertain, yet refusal was rarely possible. Marriage decisions were made collectively. Fathers negotiated unions. Dowries were exchanged. Alliances formed. A girl's personal feelings carried little weight. Her future was decided before she fully understood it. Despite this, girls were expected to adapt. Strength was required. Endurance was admired. Complaint was discouraged. A successful woman was one who survived childbirth, produced children, and upheld family honor. Romantic ideals had little place here. Love, if it came at all, arrived later, and only if survival allowed it. These realities shaped ancient societies deeply. They also shaped how adulthood was understood, because reaching adulthood did not mean freedom. It meant burden. In the final section, we'll look at what it truly meant to grow up in the ancient world and why surviving childhood changed people forever. In the ancient world, growing up was not a milestone, it was an outcome. If a child reached adulthood, it meant they had survived disease, hunger, labor, discipline, and fear. It meant they had adapted to a world that offered no protection. Adulthood did not promise ease, it promised responsibility. Adults carried the weight of survival forward. They worked relentlessly. They raised children knowing many would die. They obeyed authorities. They endured hardship without expectation of comfort. This shaped psychology. People lived closer to death. They accepted uncertainty. They planned for survival, not fulfillment. Identity was rooted in duty, not desire. Faith grew in this environment, not as philosophy, but as necessity. When people prayed, it was not abstract, it was urgent. Life depended on forces beyond control. Weather, disease, fertility, and violence shaped daily existence. Understanding ancient childhood helps explain ancient belief. It explains obedience, endurance, humility, and fear of disorder. And it explains why survival itself was seen as meaningful. Modern people often romanticize the past, but survival then required strength few today would recognize. A normal childhood did not exist, only survival did. And those who endured carried the ancient world forward. This is why studying ancient childhood matters, not to judge it, but to understand the people who lived it, and to recognize how radically different their world truly was